the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. Today, we have our second guest on the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast for another two-part series. Jon Norman is a professional engineer and economist with over 20 years' experience in the power industry, management consulting, and government. His career spans both the energy and environmental sectors as well as project management. Jon is currently president and COO at Hydrostor Inc., an internationally leading company in advanced compressed air energy storage. Now let's get into the episode.
We've been talking quite a bit about decarbonising the grid, and a slightly less sort of technical question for you. But what do you think of end users who look at all this situation and they go, well, do you know what? All this work's going on decarbonising the grid. I don't need to worry about anything. I can just meet my carbon targets if I just sit back and let the grid decarbonise. What's your view on that?
Well, I'm not sure who's saying that, because that's just obviously untrue, right? Just look at Canada's statistics on greenhouse gas emissions, right? A third comes from transport, which is direct burning of fossil fuels. A third comes from industrial, which is largely direct burning of fossil fuels. And even the balance of the third includes residential burning natural gas in the house, right? So all that to say, they might have, I mean, if someone's making that comment, they may have a fundamental point. They're just missing a step, right? Like, so I think decarbonization of the grid is a critical enabler to full decarbonization, right? Without that, you're going to really struggle, right? And so that's the first step. It's the step we're probably making the most progress on, despite all these challenges that we're talking about. And the reason we were even talking about long duration storage before and why we're here is because, some jurisdictions are getting to the point where they're at that 20% fossil fuel mark, right? And how do they get the last 20% off the grid, or not over relying on it, getting it up to 40% in bad conditions, right? Like, it's tough, right, to get to full grid decarbonization. But it is the critical enabler, because then what it allows you to do is shift transportation and industry and residential, like direct fossil fuel burning, to electricity as the backbone for their energy supply, right? Now, I have no doubt that the grid isn't the only way of doing that. Like the vehicles are sort of an interesting one, right? It's kind of like, probably 10, 15, maybe even 20 years ago here, it was like VHS versus beta, right? Are you going to go down the hydrogen fuel cell type path, or are you going to go down an electric vehicle battery type path? And I think, again, there's other forces that dictate that, right? And it kind of comes back to this, right? Like, because the batteries were developed for consumer electronics, it was very easy to adapt them to cars. And then EVs have an additional advantage in that you don't need a whole bunch of new, like, hydrogen supply infrastructure, though you do need charging infrastructure, which is still, a barrier to their full adaptation. So I think, in a sense, we picked the EV path a little bit here. There's other places like Japan where they're not even fully on board with that. Like, they think fuel cells make more sense. And they kind of have a point. Like, in a lot of ways it does, but other forces drive this kind of thing for the most efficient pathway. So, you're going to end up either way. If you're really going to be decarbonizing that 1/3 transport, 1/3 industrial, like, you're going to be using a lot of electricity to do that. And if your grid's not fully decarbonized, you're going to struggle to do that. In fact, you're going to increase your load. And so the challenge for the grid is really twofold, right? You have to enable the full decarbonization. And we're talking about the last 20%, 30% being like really difficult. So that's our game. That's what we're in right now. And lots of other people are working on it. But then even when you get to that point, you still have to deal with the substantial load growth as other sectors shift to electrical usage. And I don't think people talk about that. It's not like they're not aware of that, right? But no one's really dealing with that, right? Like, I don't think that one is even remotely getting enough attention right now. And goes back to the point of, like, the short-term thinking and, like, the 5-year batteries. And so, like, they need to be planning now for the 40-year assets like ours, but many others that need to be in place to allow for this. If like, they already have their targets in place for like 2030, 2040 that are really aggressive, like that needs action now. Like that's not just all batteries on 5-year contracts. So I think I don't know if that's directly answering your question, but clearly those other sectors and electrification of the other sectors are critical. And then the grid needs to be able to respond to that.
I think it does answer the question, and it was intentionally slightly contentious. But I think one of the things that is important for people looking at their sort of net zero plans is realizing that, if they're going to be an electricity user, that in achieving their targets to an extent is going to be dependent on the success of the grid itself decarbonising, and understanding how that works and balances with their plans. And that leads me on really to my next question. We know in the past that the utilities have tried to use pricing signals to get people to use power at times when it's available and cost effective. And so, peak shedding and various other programs like that. And so my question is, how does this fit with decarbonisation? What are there price signals that the grid could or should be giving that's going to help support decarbonisation?
Yeah, I mean, you probably write a PhD thesis on this. To me, I think where I'd start is the price signals are important, right? They're very important, and trying to get it right is actually very important. But there's a much larger underlying issue to me, having worked in a lot of, power markets globally that are all in varying stages of, having full deregulation of price signals to not really doing that to backtracking, right? Like, and the real question, sorry, my dog can be on the podcast as well.
And now our dog in the office is responding to your question. Your dog.
It's like clockwork. Somewhere between 10 and 10:30, the mailman comes. She actually liked the mailman before because I didn't have one of those slot mailboxes. Now I do, and so she feels like her space is being invaded every time. So the question really is like, are the markets themselves sufficient to incent new infrastructure? Like, never mind innovative new infrastructure, which is another barrier on top of that. And I would posit that they aren't. They haven't proven to be. They haven't quite gotten there yet, and may never, because of some fundamental limitations. So, what I would say on the good side is, like, if it's done right, and it's often done wrong, like the market design and the price signals, if it's done right, it's a really critical tool, because you want signals. To your point earlier, Dave, like those signals are important. You don't want them hidden, right? Like you need that transparency. You need to see those signals, and then it allows end users to respond appropriately. And I think, to be fair, even though it's not so much that specific subsector I'm working in, the reason you've seen a lot of sophisticated end user adoption is because there are price signals, like of decarbonizing technologies. There are price signals that are transparent enough that they can actually respond to it. So like there's been some progress there, but there's lots of drawbacks if those price signals or markets themselves, electricity markets, are the only tool. To give you an idea of like there's so many, but like one is it can't work without strong carbon pricing, because otherwise you have no environmental signal, and that hasn't actually worked that well. So the reality is, like, think of ERCOT in Texas as a great example of that, right? Like it's probably one of the world's most sophisticated power markets in terms of relying solely on the market. Like it really doesn't intervene that, but by the same token, it's not exactly carbon neutral, is it? Right. So they don't have any other objectives, no carbon pricing. It's like, it's a mess. We don't even bother working in ERCOT, even though everyone says, oh, storage signals are really good. It's like, well, if you're going to build a gas plant, like we're not competing with that. Forget it. Like just go ahead. And so it doesn't entirely work. And then the other thing is, look at what just happened in ERCOT. Everything failed because the focus was solely on the efficiency of the price signals and not the other critical factors that are going to be more expensive, like having more resiliency and somehow incenting that and making sure that's an important objective, which those price signals don't do alone, right? So it can't meet those other objectives, whether they're social, environmental, reliability. And, ERCOT's not the only place where that has been a problem. ISO New England is actually a really interesting example of that too, because you have the market operator saying, okay, we're here to meet reliability. Here are the signals. We've got good price signals and all that stuff. And the states are saying, we're screwed. We don't have enough infrastructure. Our plants are retiring. And we have these environmental objectives that aren't even close to being met, because if you just let the market bring it online. So they start contracting for resources outside of the market, and then the market collapses, right? Which is already happening in New England. The market is actually completely dysfunctional, right? And that's actually happening across, certainly happened in Ontario. Ontario is the ultimate cautionary tale in that it opens a market. The market they don't let the market actually try to work. I'm not saying it could actually, but they don't even let it. And so everything needs to be contracted. There's no longer a market. Why we talk about market reform in Ontario sometimes mystifies me a little bit. But to be fair to Ontario, I think there's one other point I'd want to get across here, which is all of these market reforms that we talk about, including Ontario and the price signals and that kind of stuff, they're always focused on the short run marginal cost. So the hourly Ontario electricity price is an indicator of the marginal cost in that hour, right? It's the same in ERCOT. It's the same everywhere. But you can't fully transition a grid. You can't even build any new infrastructure without a long run marginal cost signal. In other words, what's the average cost of your generation to bring on that capacity, right? And so you've seen a lot of markets put band-aids on to try and fix that, and they put in capacity markets and that kind of thing. And now there's a big debate about how long contract terms should be in the capacity markets. But at the end of the day, you get to the same place. It's you actually need to have some kind of competitive process. You need to have some objective you're trying to hit, and you've got to allow these resources to be built out, having their capacity recognized and that value reimbursed, right? Because otherwise the short run cost signal can't do it alone. And that's sort of proven to be the case time and time again. And I think there's a tendency, maybe last point on this, to, the market purists will look at oil and gas markets and say, well, this is what we should be doing. The difference with the oil and gas markets is that they're truly fungible. They're truly, global and international, and there's really good information. Whereas electricity isn't like that. It's like a natural monopoly. There's wires. There's how do you, these aren't identical constructs. And so the comments I was making earlier are really more about what's actually happening on the power markets. And one of the things I think that needs to happen to fix it is less emphasis, like in Ontario, for example, of somehow just price signals are going to solve everything, or an ERCOT, right? Which is proven time and time again to not be the case. So they're important, but they're not enough. You need this other stuff, whether it's a properly functioning capacity market or just contracting mechanisms. And you need ways of recognizing that long run marginal cost of the infrastructure, innovative new infrastructure, everything.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because what we're saying is price signals work, but if you want to get what you want out of it, they've got to be the right price signals about the right things. And and I think your comment about the short-term approach on everything, I think that is a major problem for all of us involved in trying to head towards net zero or whatever we're doing, because we need long-term solutions, but we've got an awful lot of short-term thinking.
Yeah.
It's actually a really good dialogue, John, that you brought up, because we have this ongoing discussion all the time. I'm a firm believer of market signals, but your point of how it has to be set up properly, and you have to have many more items that have to be included and done correctly to make sure it works. That's a significant and a really valid point. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's come through the school of hard knocks. And that's but incidentally, that's the other thing that I found frustrating. Well, certainly sitting here in Toronto, is all these markets tend to sort of plan in isolation, right? And so they're all sort of out doing their own thing, but everyone's crossed this ground before in different, there's not enough cross jurisdictional learning happening. And
Yeah.
someone in a company who kind of straddles across different borders, you see that really, really well because like all jurisdictions are sort of struggling with the same stuff, but they're doing it completely differently, and then they're tripping over the same rocks. And so, I think if only there was a way to have those cross jurisdictional learnings sent along, that I don't know, that I think it would help.
It sounds like it would completely help because there would be efficiencies associated with the learning and the speed of acceptance and implementation. So it's a really good point. It's perhaps a discussion point that we might have in a future session, but thank you for that. That's really good. Your project is one of many that aim to reduce reliance on the grid. And what's the trajectory that you predict for grid versus self-generation ratio? For instance, in the next 5, 10, 20 years time, what percentage of organizations will be using grid exclusively versus what you think self-generation or a combo of both? Do you have a comment on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing is maybe a reiteration of, like, we're not really a behind the meter resource. We actually really are a utility scale resource. And one of the reasons I joined Hydrostor is because of this exact question, Dave. Like, I don't think it's nice to sort of envisage a theoretical future where everything becomes decentralized, people generate their own electricity, and that's kind of how everything works, and it's kind of self ownership. Like, I think there's a philosophical appeal to that I would have that appeal as well. But I think that centralization itself is not evil, and in fact, it's almost inevitable now, right? Like, let's not, all these wires are already in place. So, like, I sometimes think it was like a thought experiment in my head. If we actually lived in a world where everything was completely decentralized, and we like totally, and I say this as an environmentalist myself, environmentalists would be screaming bloody murder that there's not more centralization, right? Because it's actually so inefficient, right? Like, it's,
Yeah.
why wouldn't you use resources more efficiently in a centralized fashion? And if you actually lived in that world, it would almost be impossible to do because you'd have to build the wires to get to that point anyway. But this already exists, right? So now we're talking about, let's move to this place that might be less efficient, not for everything. There's a right balance, but like, it might be less efficient if you take it too far. And you're going to strand trillions of dollars of grid infrastructure at the same time. Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? And so the reality is, I don't know what the ratio is, like, to your question, but it's going to be somewhere in between. And I think it fundamentally will be driven by economics, hopefully including carbon price, like proper carbon price signals, right? But with that in mind, we've got to get better at, like, the full life cycle accounting and so on, because that's more where I come out of. And that's why I know intuitively the notion of decentralization, like, as a concept for decarbonization or for environmental benefits, doesn't actually make a lot of sense, right? Like, and just look at decentralized technologies. Like, they're not benign, right? Batteries require massive disposal. Like, they have huge resource use issues. The reality is, we don't even have, like, the level of battery penetration we're talking about to get to these stages much, much higher than what we even have now. And there isn't really a clear solution to that. So somebody do the life cycle accounting, even with the solution. Like, what's the full life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of using a battery, right? And the reality is, it's the same thing with behind the meter renewables. These are resource intensive equipment. They're really good in that their fuel is free, like solar and wind resources and so on. But it comes back to the question of scale, right? Like, I think for a lot of applications, that's fine, but clearly the small scale resources are inefficient compared to the larger scale ones. So how many smaller scale ones do you want serving all of the terawatt hours of load in the world? Because you're going to end up with fewer greenhouse gas reductions per dollar spent by your society, right? So I think there's a balancing act there. And I actually do think on the load management side in general, that could be much, much better, right? It's starting to change because technology is enabling it. So allowing customers the choice, regardless of like where you think they're philosophically at, allowing customers the choice is going to move in that direction and become more second nature for people to do that. And so that's already starting to happen. It's getting much, much better. But a key question is whether, supply itself should then be decentralized. I think that's a separate question that tends to get lumped together in this kind of grand vision. And I don't think that actually 100% makes sense. I think it partially makes sense. And even if it 100% made sense, it couldn't happen overnight, right? So like that's why certainly like a solution provider like us, we're actually targeting the direct centralized resources to replace them, right? So they can't just disappear tomorrow. Like that's not going to work. That's not going to transition us anywhere. And so you actually need clean technologies that are able to replace them. And I do think it's a bit of maybe future prediction, but I don't think even like decades and decades in the future, you'll be in a place that's completely decentralized, because it actually doesn't make sense to completely decentralize. But again, you can't do that tomorrow either.
It comes back to your point of how these individual grids are operating separately, as opposed to learning from each other how they could do things better if they just learned from all the lessons from each other. It's the same philosophy, I think. This whole idea of centralizing the whole thought process. I found that fascinating, John, and I think it's a really good point. I do believe it's going to be a hybrid effect. I think the DR there'll be a role. It will create some competitive forces and drive some things, but I think your life cycle costing is something I'm not sure many people have actually factored. So I think it's a great point.
Yeah, it's definitely not factored, other than maybe in government policies, which themselves are sort of inefficient because they're just trying to correct market failures. So,
John, I'd like to sort of take the conversation in a slightly different direction. We've been talking a lot about how we can decarbonise and everything else, and we all know that that's part of our mitigation response for climate change. But as many current events pointing out to us, climate change has happened, will continue to happen. We certainly aren't going to reverse it, I don't think, in the foreseeable future. And it would appear that there's a less open conversation about how we're going to adapt to the inevitability of climate change that is happening and is going to happen. And I wondered if you could speak to that topic.
yeah, well, I mean, I actually think that conversation is happening a lot, and it's happening below the radar, right?
Yeah.
And because if I back up a step just to like why adaptation, I mean, this is inevitable, right? I mean, we have our head in the sand if we think that we can even meet a 1.5 to 2 degree increase, Celsius increase in global warming. We need to prepare for like 3 to 4 degree. And that's even with like fairly rapid action on decarbonization. So the writing is on the wall there. I think everybody realizes that. I'm not sure to your point, how the media is dealing. I think in the past, what's happened is there's been a philosophical barrier to that discussion because it avoids action on the cause, right? And
yes,
but we're now past that point, and there's new thinking required, on both fronts. So there's a lot of talk about mitigation, and that's something we're obviously focused on. But interestingly, we're also focused on adaptation. I mean, if you think about as a company, if you think about the new thinking that's already happening, like below the surface, I mean, cities and flooding, that's already happening all over the place. So there's already massive amounts of money being spent on dealing with this, but the decisions will get bigger and bigger. Like, do we have to relocate populations? Like, what are we going to do? But inevitably, crisis will drive that change, and you're already starting to see the crisis. So that's what's happening in the background. The other crises, obviously, we're seeing are wildfires that are pretty consistent everywhere, and it has the same impact on people's living conditions. So how do we deal with that? It has impact on industry as well. Storm intensity is clearly already changing, and so there's massive adaptation already happening. So if you're sitting in the city of Toronto, I haven't had this discussion with City of Toronto planners, but I would hope they're not just sitting there saying like, okay, still planning around the 1 in 100 year flood line, right? Like, I mean, because if you think about like Toronto's a pretty safe place to be overall. There's not that much wildfire risk here. We don't have other sort of catastrophic events very often. Storms here, sure, not the biggest deal, but nobody is escaping from flooding. Like nobody's escaping from drought. What we've built our city around is assumptions on the 1 in 100 year flood. It's assumptions around our water supply and how much we can rely on it without algae change in Lake Ontario and that kind of stuff. And the only thing we know that's going to happen is it's going to change. And when it changes, that's going to be a cost. So I doubt the responsible City of Toronto planners are sitting there saying, at the very least, they're not saying, oh yeah, we'll allow this development to proceed right in this new area without sort of factoring that into account a little bit. But there's a lot more that needs to happen there. And so I actually think that discussion's already happening, even though the media hasn't entirely picked it up. And what to tie it back to Hydrostor also, what's interesting is that fundamentally, it's obvious how we're a mitigation company, right? Like we're a greenhouse gas, low zero emission solution for the future, but we're also an adaptation provider, right? Like our systems provide resiliency. Like it reduces the needs for new transmission that are triggering wildfires in California. It reduces the reliance on single fuel resources, right? And that can always be disrupted and increasingly are being disrupted. And so a lot of times what's actually even driving utilities to look at the solution is at least in part that adaptation consideration. And that's part of the case in California too, why they're focused on long duration storage, because it's actually about resiliency more than anything else.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the comment about the media, I think the popular media has a real problem in holding two views or two aspects of the same topic at the same time. It has to deal with one. And I'm sorry to say, I think globally, many of our politicians also have the same problem.
Yeah.
And I think you're right.
You're raising
Yeah.
an interesting point, John, in that I hadn't really thought about before, because I was going to make that point. People say that of politicians all the time, but the actual root cause, I think you're right, is probably more the media and
Yes.
our inability to digest stories that aren't as simple. Like
Yeah.
politicians are reactive by nature, right?
Yes.
And so we've created that construct with our media and our media consumption. So
I think
completely
I
agree.
think for good or bad, we're very much in a media-led world, and it was a time when the media was reporting what was happening. You could argue now that because of the way that they do things, they're actually influencing what happens. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's a whole nother podcast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, and I think, John, the purpose of this podcast that we're trying to do is to educate the marketplace so people can make better decisions. So these are great topics and points of view for people to hear. Again, I thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
John, this has been an excellent conversation to listen to, and it brings me to our last question for you. You briefly touched on this earlier, but there are many models of utility ownership out there, from straight state and municipal to private to ownership by Indigenous communities. When it comes to reducing carbon and sustainability, which models are showing the most promise?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think it goes down another path a little bit. Like I actually think the question about like decarbonization and utility ownership, it's a bit less about the ownership and probably more about the incentives, which is why we were talking about kind of the regulated structure and what are the incentives that are put on these utilities. Like that's the most fundamental barrier. But I do think that moving ownership control to more diverse entities helps, and it's proven to help. And it's kind of obvious why it would help. Like the same way that the United States looks at the states as kind of little policy experiments all over the place, you end up with more ideas and diversity, and that allows for better outcomes in the long run. I think the same holds true of utility ownership. I mean, it gets a little absurd at certain points. Like you don't want I think Ontario at one point had 360 utilities or something like that. That doesn't make any sense, right? But at the right balance, that's actually can be hugely valuable. And I think there are examples of, where that works pretty well. Again, California tends to just dive into these sorts of things, right? So in California, there's already these entities called community choice aggregators that have been formed at basically municipal entities. And what happened was it was a sort of, in a sense, a political backlash. There really were three major utilities, investor-owned utilities that are regulated in California. There's Pacific Gas and Electric, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Edison. And PG&E in particular was really unpopular. And they took over mandate basically the load of San Francisco and all of this stuff. The city of San Francisco hates them, right? Like, and all of the municipalities hate them, right? And so even despite the government almost, and then using their political strength, they created their own load serving entities they called community choice aggregators. There's like a Clean Power SF in San Francisco. There's about a dozen or more of these, probably quite a bit more actually, across California, that are serving huge amounts of California load now. And this has all happened in 5 years. Like these guys, when you're like a Brookfield on the other side and we look at contracting with these guys, you'd be like, they're not even credit worthy. Who are these guys? But they've evolved a lot. Like many of them are very credit worthy, very sophisticated, and much more progressive, right? So they are looking at long duration storage technologies, for example, in California, ahead of the other utilities that are just waiting to be told by the regulator, right? And so they look at things differently, and they are sort of little policy experiments. So I think that's actually a really interesting example of that. But to kind of close off on my point as well, that is it really about ownership or about the incentives? Like, well, we're also working with Ontario Power Generation, the exact polar opposite of that here in Ontario on long duration storage. And, they're kind of plowing ahead, and they haven't selected it as their solution yet, but they're serious about it. And it kind of shows that both models can work. But I do think you've always got to try new things, I think. And so doing that more, like that community choice aggregator type model elsewhere in the world, I think can help. If Ontario even had a load serving entity model, for example, instead of, only the IESO as the grid operator procures on behalf of the province, well, there's a role for that for sure. But what if there were broader regional LSEs, load serving entities that serve their own needs and could actually do that in progressive ways? And the province could then be a backstop. So like there's multiple ways to slice and dice it. But overall, I think, having more diversity in ownership is helpful.
Well, I think that's a great way to end off our episode. Thank you again, Jon, for joining us today. I can confidently say myself, Dave, Jon, and our listeners have taken away something valuable from this episode. Any final comments, Dave and Jon?
I echo what you're saying, Sandra. Jon, I felt the material that was covered. I learned a lot, and thank you very much for sharing your insight and your experience. It was really helpful, and I'm sure the listeners are going to pick up a lot.
Yeah, I think it helps to sometimes look at the broader picture from a different point of view. That I think this discussion's been really valuable from that point of view.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, actually, and they're really good questions. So thanks for putting it on, guys. I think this is good work that you're doing. Hopefully you have many dozens more of these podcast episodes, and helps inform the industry and shows different perspective on things, because there are many, right? And you're asking the right questions.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Jon. Thank you.
Thank you.
The 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. Today, we have our second guest on the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast for another two-part series. Jon Norman is a professional engineer and economist with over 20 years' experience in the power industry, management consulting, and government. His career spans both the energy and environmental sectors as well as project management. Jon is currently president and COO at Hydrostor Inc., an internationally leading company in advanced compressed air energy storage. Now let's get into the episode.